What is it like to hold the fate of the world in your hand? That is a perspective that very few of us will ever get to experience. And to be clear, a few of us have. I mean, we have, points in military history where the proverbial hand was being held over the nuclear war button at a time when the bidding of armaments was never higher. And there's been other decisions like that made throughout human history, and I'm sure a lot of those stories, frankly, we'll never hear. But what's interesting is that for us as humans, that proverbial button is always a one-way ticket. You have the world in your hands so far as you want to destroy it, but that same person is not going to be in as nearly much control when it comes to rebuild the world as they are destroying it. The perspective of simultaneously being an absolute destroyer on par with being an absolute creator is something humans really haven't come into contact with. We haven't experienced that, right? We can't make it rain, we can't make high-yield crops erupt from the earth or purify water as fast as a bomb can wipe all those things out. But what if you could? What if your hand was over the button to destroy everything, but unlike the people from our history who only had a one-way ticket to annihilation, that same hand could remake the world into something you wanted? What kind of person would want that kind of responsibility, right? Knowing tens of thousands of people will die, and that's just destroying the old world. That's before the people born into your new world that you're now responsible for, because you're responsible for all the pain and suffering that the world causes them now too. What kind of person would want to play that role? How do they lead? How do they adjudicate law or defend their people? Or what do they take pride in? What are their eccentricities? I mean, if we're talking about someone that lofty, right, a person's little things, their little nuances or whatever can start to have massive effects. And why am I mentioning all of this? Well, in the game Conquest: Last Arguments of Kings, there's a faction who's been in that position. They had their hands over the proverbial doomsday button, but unlike us, they also had a chance to remake the world. The decisions involved in both breaking the old world and forging a new one are of such magnitude that they're foundational to the setting, and every faction in the Conquest setting can probably say they have a bone to pick with the Sorcerer Kings, which is today's subject. Welcome, Wargamers, mages, and god killers of Ea. Today we are talking about the Sorcerer Kings. And I did one about them a long time ago, back when we just had the little faction teaser. It was like a half a page of script. This is going to be adding on to that, refreshing it, whatever. Today is the meat and potatoes of this army. And actually, this is because I want to cover the last campaign set that came out featuring the Sorcerer Kings and the city-states. But it occurred to me I never actually updated my Sorcerer Kings lore, so we're going to do this in order to do that. Unlike the last one of those little campaign sets they had, that was Dweg and Spire, and so I had those videos, I just didn't even think about it. And so today we're going to be introducing the faction of the Sorcerer Kings as a more broad level, and how they got their hands over the Doomsday button, and how they chose to rebuild their world. In subsequent videos, we'll talk about the sub-factions, and that's basically how this society is divided up in terms of its power structure to represent special forces that we can bring to the tabletop. In this case, there's only two sub-factions. There's the Elemental Courts and the Enclaves. One thing I like to say right up top, if you like Conquest and you're interested in this faction, please consider using the affiliate link in the description down below. Bellum is fantastic to work with, and they have an awesome community. They give me a little discount code for all my listeners, and every single time you use it, at no cost to you, it throws a tip in my tip jar for me, my wife, the channel. It's all life-changing stuff, and I appreciate every single bit of it. Also, Goonhammer has been doing a really great, consistent job of putting out Conquest content, so if you want to learn more about playing the game, or kind of getting your bearings on getting started, go check out Goonhammer. For those of you who are new to Conquest or the faction of the Sorcerer Kings, we all are, so here's the elevator pitch I'll give to you. In days long ago, when the Dominion reigned supreme, the god of mankind, Haslia, ruled. Towards the end of the Dominion's time, a relatively small scientific/philosophical community, we'll call it, began to understand what was happening. Haslia was being empowered by the worship of mankind, and was a creature, but not necessarily a benevolent deity. It's just a creature with an energy source and a vested interest in keeping mankind worshipping it. So some took this knowledge and set to create their own domains, and kind of seeing the whole Haslia thing as unsustainable. Right? At some point, Haslia is going to want more than we can give, and so this group of people is saying, check please, we're going to hop out of here, we're going to leave. Some of them took the knowledge they had learned about the esoteric and went and founded the city-states, who we've talked about in a full series. Protected by arcane sciences based on what they learned about divine mechanisms and power. But another section of those same pool of scholars who began to understand what was happening went a different way. I don't want to run and isolate myself from Haslia's touch. They wanted mankind unshackled from a false god, one whose influence was already kind of spiraling towards the end. It was really starting to fall apart with the bureaucracy and the weight of the Dominion. Haslia wasn't keeping up with the attention and the maintenance to his people. So instead of saying, check please, and some of them leaving, these are the ones of that group who said, get me my gun. The Sorcerer Kings are a caste-based mageocracy descended from these initial sorcerers, this cabal that gathered might and conducted a spell of such magnitude that it shattered Haslia in the blackened skies of Capitas. That event, like we've said before, it spawned a ton of cascading effects, right? The 100 Kingdoms began, their march eastward, or westward rather. The Dweghome now had a big push because the Dominion was crumbling and now there's this land that's undefended. The city-states were founding at the tail end of that. What I'm getting at is the fall of the Dominion is the pivotal moment in the setting. And its final act was instigated by the people who would become the Sorcerer Kings. Now let's think about this for perspective, right? We mentioned having your hand over the Doomsday button, right? Killing Haslia sounds like a great plan. Boom, hit the button, free the people. But you also have to remember that this is an event that also straight up killed tens of thousands of people who were in the city. This is the capital of the Dominion. It's where the god was struck down. And this whole place essentially got wiped out. At the push of a button, it created, a commerce and supply shortage, food shortages, a refugee crisis. People are running in every direction. It rendered immense tracts of fertile land full of death and entropy. And I bring all this up because what I want to hammer home is that their plan to bring down Haslia knowingly negatively affected far more people than this cabal ever intended to save. They were okay with destroying the old world and the many to create a new utopia for the few. And I'm hoping this highlights the incredible arrogance that the Sorcerer Kings are known for. That they know better, they can do it better. Nothing else matters if it doesn't affect them and their plans to create a better world. But now they have no place to go, right? I mean, Capitas is a charred pit of death, and they need a new home. So, they made their own. A place that didn't exist on any maps because the place did not exist when the maps were made. After pulling all their power to kill a god, the Sorcerer Kings, that initial cabal, pulled their power to raise a continent to the south. It took some time, but then again, so did killing Haslia. It's a process, but this is where their story begins as a new entity on the scene. And again, what world would you create? And what does the suffering and the attitudes of the people in your world say about you? Now keep in mind, as we're in our story in a linear fashion, right? Capitas is destroyed, they're moving southward to raise their new continent. At this point, it's a large cabal of wizards and their families and other noble families. Essentially, we kind of almost get the sense that they planned out like an arc, is how I'm gonna kind of express it. We raise X land, it can support Y population, we can grow at Z rate, and the end goal being we're going to free humanity completely and come back and rule everything. So there was a stable, sizable population, nothing compared to what they just annihilated, but this is their shot. From that initial cabal, 4 of the OG Sorcerer Kings made it to this new world. And these are the characters that still permeate the society today. There's Ermi, who moves the oceans, Dylan, pyre of gods and men, Hormus, who lays mountains low, and Alessa, weaver of winds and fates. These 4 mages represent the fundamental pillars of Sorcerer King discipline and knowledge. They are the 4 elemental magics that make up the god Balance, whom the Sorcerer Kings venerate. We talked about Balance briefly. Basically, it's one of their primordial gods that exists. Lots of fantasy settings have these kinds of things beyond the pale. Their interpretation is that Balance settled and became the world that we know as Ea. So they're tapping into elemental magic, the things that the world is made of. And so the 4 of them looked at this new rock they had raised from the ocean and remade it into a fertile and thriving land. Then cut off the peninsula that connected them from the mainland for defense. Complete isolation on an island that nobody knew existed because it didn't exist before. And so now they have a new world, a utopia. And this is where stuff starts to get complicated. Because these 4 mages, seemingly of infinite wisdom and power, left their creation to their lessers. Basically, those 4 initial Sorcerer Kings created everything and then said, okay, our island needs to be magically stabilized, and also we're going to work remote on, basically fixing the weather and the devastation that we wrought with the fall of the Dominion. Basically, it's a long-term plan. We're going to make it up to everybody in the long run. But we're going to go away and do that. We made you a perfect utopia. You guys figure it out. So each of these Sorcerer Kings delegated a portion of their authority. Remember, 25% of the kingdom, because they split it equally, to a successor to reign in their name instead. So the 4 of them all go off, and these 4 nascent kingdoms are left to build. What kind of society did they decide to create? Well, from a top-down perspective, this is a magocracy. The greater your understanding and control over magical power, the higher your rank, and vice versa. So you can assume someone at a high rank has a lot of knowledge. Lower, less magical classes will work the more menial jobs of labor, harvesting resources to build and expand the empire. And as you go up the hierarchy, you'll see more magically oriented, but also more arrogant and savvy people. Families that produce a higher than average number of mage-blessed kids will elevate in status, creating an internal class society based on the utility that you can bring to the kingdoms via magic or magically gifted people. As sorcerers live longer and gain more and more arcane knowledge, they can almost begin to seem like deities walking around mortals. Because the average person just fails to grasp how much control these wizards have over the world. And separately from the main story of Ea, where all these other nations are building and churning and fighting, the Sorcerer Kings have been developing and growing in isolation. Now, one thing to note here is they've been fighting ongoing battles against exiles seeking to claim a piece of their land. Someone found their little island, and they want to be a part of it. However, the Sorcerer Kings are drawing a line and saying, no, this is ours. And that last little point really isn't touched on too much. It was kind of a note in the initial section of their teaser, but I thought they were going to expand more on these refugees, and they really didn't. But the core idea to hit home here is that the Sorcerer Kings want control of the world because they believe in their arrogance that they're the best ones to manage it. But at the same time, they want to be removed from it. They don't want to just invite people to come in and get a better life. They want to rule it. And it's becoming increasingly harder to have both. Now, from this point, to kind of give a head start on my next videos, those 4, I call them kingdoms. They're not really, they're just kind of disciplines of the magical force of balance. The societies that each of those 4 kingdoms created have the sole purpose of just supporting the wizards. The jobs that menial laborers do provides food and economics to be able to get families to have kids, to have more magic kids, to fill the ranks of the Sorcerer Kings with wizards. Everything, from all the prosperity to the toil, is all about strengthening them as a faction. And so as we go into the next 2 videos in this series talking about the Elemental Courts, which is the higher end of the caste system, those who are magically gifted and what their path of discipline looks like. And then there's the Enclaves, which represent the everyman. Right, if you and I were suddenly dropped into Sorcerer King society, by weight of numbers, we would probably end up in the Enclaves. But they are also full of their own kind of intrigue because, again, the Sorcerer Kings might be the head, but that makes the enclaves the neck. And so I want to end this video, like I end all of them, by simply asking, why is this cool, right? And today, simply put, was a history lesson. And rest assured, we're going to talk about fire demons and elementals of hell and monsters pouring out of it very soon. But I wanted to focus on how this faction sits with the others, right? The events that they set into motion, the suffering of entire nation states, the birthing of new ones. But they don't want to take responsibility for a group of refugees that washes up on shore. At least that's how they're perceived. You can't tell me that you're the goodest and the best, and then when you have an opportunity to do good, you scorn it. And also keep in mind that the average person in this setting would not know the details of all this, right? They see an arrogant kingdom of wizards who talk like we owe them something because they say they did something good for us. But the average person doesn't know about Hazlia and how gods work and stuff like that, right? How this ancient cabal killed their god. They just see what's in front of them. And it's easy to despise them from that perspective. And I feel like that's articulated with the way that they have so many kind of seeds of story with other factions. But on the other hand, what do you do if you see the direction the world is headed and know it's a disaster? Like, what else was there to do, right? Be a slave to a parasitic god for eternity? Like, I can see both sides of it. And like I said at the top, while you can conceptually understand the intellectual doing all the math on the board of the pros and cons of a plan, you can get lost in that, but you can't help but be captivated by the kind of person who would do this, who would have their hand over the doomsday button, who thinks that they are so infallible that the same hand that destroys everything is also the best hand to create it. And that is essentially the internal struggle of this faction. They are destroyers and creators, and they are incredibly arrogant about both. But they have a relatively small footprint on the world stage because for all their utopia, they just did not bring a ton of people, and they're not growing their empire by bringing in new folks. Thus, they are a very elite force, in terms of like lore or whatever. I'm not talking points to models or whatever like that. But there's just very few of them. Certainly few of them that are going to go out across the stretches of water to then start invading other places. But ultimately, that's the plan. As we'll find out later in our videos, the ultimate plan is to basically reconquer everything so that mankind can be supreme upon Ea, masters of the fundamental elements of balance, the world in which we live. But that's going to take some conquering, and that's going to take some time. And we've seen what happens in our own history when small island nations try to eat an elephant and overexert themselves, usually in the form of colonies and stuff like that historically. But like when a smaller power goes to take on a larger one, even just in terms of landmass, it's so demanding. And so we get this great snapshot of an empire just about to make that switch. The switch from pure isolationist building up their own power to then pointing that at the throat of the other world. The one that they left smoldering before. So think about that when you put your mini Raj on the table. Honestly, I think they're a really cool faction. I was a little bit confused by them initially because it seemed like, well, what's their struggle, right? What are they good at if they're good at everything? Kind of the same way I feel about Superman. I'm just like, meh, it's not fun if he's good at everything. They're good at magic. Oh, they can create a whole new world. Oh, they can do. But they really are tempered by the fact that, one, their population is very small. The path to achieving that power is incredibly dangerous, so it has a filter on its own. And the repercussions of their actions are such that they've made enemies of the world. And their bedside manner isn't helping them gain any more, but you know what I mean. It makes them compelling from a story perspective. They approach situations with an air of arrogance and decisiveness that other factions don't have, who allows them to be more reactionary, which is a power in itself. What I'm saying is they fit well into the ecosystem and certainly the history of Ea, and we're going to talk more about their society as we dive into those other two videos. So thank you all so much for watching and listening. I hope that you're enjoying the Conquest content. I'm going to be doing a bit more of it here for the Sorcerer Kings, and then like I said, we're jumping into the campaign stuff that just released for them in the city-states. Thank you for watching, listening, and happy wargaming, friends!